On this episode of Culture Matters, we take a deep dive into communication and culture. Our guest is Merima Baralic, Communications and Consumer Relations Director for Africa, Middle East and South Asia at PepsiCo. Merima is based in Sydney, Australia, and she looks after a virtual Centre of Excellence team. We all know that culture and communication are inextricably intertwined. In this episode, which is divided into 4 parts, Merima will share with us lessons she has learned from her experience and expertise leading remote teams across time zones and locations. In part 1, we find out more about how Merima defines culture, how one can build or create a culture, and how important communication is when it comes to culture.
To me personally, culture is a living, breathing set of norms that a group identifies and determines, whether that be consciously or subconsciously. Culture is not something that is fixed. It's sort of ever evolving, whether that be in a workplace or in a society. If we talk about workplace culture, it's where you often hear people asking about it, work interviews to determine whether they're the right fit, because a certain type of culture can either attract talent or repel it. So your reputation is formed around workplace cultures, and this travels fast, in my experience, further than any paid advertising that an organization can put out there. So, for me, culture of an organization is key, and it's shaped by myself directly, those around me, and it makes a difference of whether, I dread going to work on Mondays, or if I have a spring in my step showing up for work each day. Each and every one of us have an impact in shaping the culture of our workplace, of our homes, or the community, I guess, as an ecosystem. We all drive and mold it with, for example, our behaviors. And that could be what we choose to do, what we choose not to do. I guess when we create a workplace culture, we need to know what we're looking for and what kind of environment we'd like to thrive and work in. So once we define what it is that we want to create, then we kind of define the key principles and the values to help support the culture that we want to create. So a great example of that is something that I recently saw in an email signature from one of our clients that says, at XY organization, we have a flexible working policy. I'm sending you this email at a time that suits me. Please feel free to respond when it suits you. I find that very powerful because it speaks volumes to the culture that that organization has and the stand that they're taking on flexible working. Many of your listeners would know culture is created both verbally and non-verbally, and sometimes what you don't say is as powerful as what you do say. Communication is really the key, both verbal and non-verbal. So people often, say that formal communication embeds the culture, but what I find is that the key driver is leadership communication. Corporate communication, think your formal organizational announcements, your newsletters, your posters, your town halls, they're all very important, but they need to support your leadership communication, which is sort of the key. Regardless of what, your culture is, the communication that is shaping it needs to be authentic and it needs to be genuine. Comms cannot be disconnected from, what your leaders really believe in. And if you communicate something and your leaders across all levels are not walking the talk, then it's kind of a flawed system. And your culture will be also reflective of this. Ideally, the culture stems from the values that our leaders are driving, and everything else kind of branches from there. So these don't necessarily have to be your top senior executive leaders. We often find that, mid-level managers have an immense impact. They tend to reach more people. They have a bigger sphere of influence. So your formal communication becomes a support mechanism to further embed something that your leaders are already saying and doing. To me, once those two things marry, that basically shows that the leadership is authentic, the communication is in tune with the reality of the organization and its values. When these stars align and you rally kind of the troops behind your certain goals, you really create a culture that your organization needs.
So, in part 1 of this episode of Communication and Culture, we've learned how Merima defines culture, how she creates and builds culture across geographies and time zones, and the importance of communication when it comes to culture. In part 2, we find out more about location-free roles and how to manage remote teams. Tune in again to the next part of this episode of Culture Matters by Engaging Leaders.